I forgot to initiate the room, but that's okay.
Wh-
So
wh-
yeah, he's fine. Everyone's fine.
Good.
He's okay.
Yeah, I'm like one of the last few people I can think of it in Village Hall who hasn't gotten it yet.
Well,
Gosh.
Yeah, I haven't
Be
gotten
careful what
it
you
yet,
wish
as
for.
far as I know, but you know, it's all over the place.
Yeah, it's really reemerging.
Yep.
So, I should have looked, but the last time I looked on the website, the adopted budget, I don't know.
It's not up yet because I was actually looking today because I was preparing some resolutions for the board meeting, for next Monday's board meeting, and I was looking at to see if for the reference, if that was up there, but it's not. But I know what the numbers are.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how does it work if you had mentioned that you guys met whatever the series of state mandated deadlines were, and if the version that was adopted needed to be submitted, presumably the consolidated wasn't submitted, and if that's the case, and then it
Well,
may
yeah, I mean,
be
the
incorporated into what's going to get posted, is that something that can
Yeah,
be
no,
done?
we're gonna incorporate that document into the final budget. We didn't ask the board to
Great.
adopt the capital budget and plan because that, it's a 5-year program. But there are certain items that right now we're looking to talk to the board about that we're planning to do in the course of the next year to get the approvals to initiate the design process so that we can go back to them when we have contracts and purchases ready for them to award.
Design of what again?
Like various projects, like for instance, we're going to be performing playground improvements at Jefferson Avenue Park. So, what we did last week is we did our research. We got quotes for the playground equipment, quotes for the ancillary site improvements. We spoke with the board. They gave us the go-ahead to initiate the design. And then when it's time to start purchasing, we're going to go back to them with purchase contracts for stuff we can buy off state contract and construction contracts for the public works portions of the project.
Okay, so because a capital budget wasn't adopted, that affords the flexibility to incorporate whatever you may into the document that is going to be ultimately posted to the website. But that document reads will that document read that it's the adopted budget, or?
Yeah, it's the adopted budget. It's the capital budget is, and I call it the capital budget and plan, is an appendix to the budget.
All right, so Dan,
Okay,
I have
cool.
a question. Who makes the decision or the determination on which projects of that 5-year plan gets chosen to be put before the board?
Well, it's really, kind of a staff initiated process. I mean, we have, things like, an easy one, we'll just talk about the public works budget. Most of the public works budget is replacing rolling stock. Heavy equipment, systems, like, building systems, things like that. So we know when those things reach the end of their useful life, they're on a replacement schedule. When it's time to replace it, we, get the pricing, we go to the board, ask them to approve the
All right.
purchase.
That's fine, but who determines, and it's gonna sound like I'm backing you into a corner, and I apologize because I'm not doing that. But who's making the determination that doing a playground is more important than some other discretionary project that's not rolling stock?
Well, I mean, as part of the capital budget, that's what we did is by department, each project is ranked within its own department. So if there are 10 projects from, say, the Parks Department, they'll be given a rank of 1 through 10, or they'll, or 1 through 5 in case of like most important, not as important, that type of stuff. So each department is required to prioritize their own projects.
All right, let me ask the question differently. When does the board, or does the board take a look at the department's priorities and say, no, I don't think that's the most important thing?
Well, we review the capital budget with the board. And, ultimately, the board has to authorize any funding for a capital project. So we have to go back to them when we're ready to move forward with something. So, there's the initial review during the capital budget review process. And then there's the ultimate review when the rubber hits the road and, they have to approve funding for the project. They can always say no to funding a project.
Right, so when you, again, let's stick with the playground, and I'm not picking on you, I apologize again. So when you put this before the board for them to approve funding, do you, or does anybody explain why this is a critical project to take precedence over something else?
Again, we review it during the capital budget process. Every item that's sent to the village board is typically accompanied by a memo explaining why what the project is, why it's important. It's not like we don't initiate some sort of Hunger Games process to say, this one is more important than that one. But we try to move forward with projects that are priorities based on the department head input.
Yeah, and believe me, I'm no one to pick on a playground. And
Yeah.
if, there's a slide that somebody could get killed on, that's an issue. And
Yeah.
the decision whether to close the playground or fix the slide that somebody could get killed
I
on.
was just using that as
May-
the
may-
example.
Yeah, no,
But I think it's a good example because
Yeah,
it's the example of what was brought up as being the first project that's
Yeah.
being put before the board to get done.
Yeah.
And based on the prioritization criteria, if a child could get killed on the slide, that's one thing. If it's somebody's preference to have a new modern playground and it hasn't been evaluated whether the other safety and legal projects that need to get done this year are potentially not going to be able to get done because the playground's getting done, that's
so
something to address.
there are criteria which are factored in establishing the priorities. One of which include, I think the biggest priority is if there's a mandate or a legal requirement to effectuate the project. And then we're going to look at other factors. For instance, with equipment, if it's reached the end of its useful life, it's going to cost more to maintain it than it would be to get a new piece of equipment. And there are a variety of factors. Just to use playgrounds again, one of the reasons why Jefferson Avenue playground is a priority is because the current playground equipment is so old that we can't source replacement parts for it anymore. So, that you don't want to be, and Ellen, a perfect example is of the former playground that is in your neighborhood at Warren Avenue Park.
Yep,
We couldn't use that playground for several years because the equipment was, we couldn't repair it. It was totally unusable. And we were able to effectuate a nice project that benefited, the local community and the entire village.
now, I'm not opposed to doing playgrounds, it's just
No,
this
I'm
whole
just saying that.
decision-making process.
No, there are a bunch of criteria, and the criteria are explained in the capital budget.
I just want to jump in. I know there was an email circulated, which my budget committee colleagues may have seen. It was called Trucks. And it was kind of Jerry sent it. It was just kind of a plea, I think, about, I think it was a DPW? You must be familiar with this email, Dan, about one of the, maybe it was a Parks Department truck.
I think it was Parks.
That was, yeah, that was falling apart, literally.
Yeah,
And so, I mean, if we have a replacement cycle and the Parks Department trucks seem to be, a number of them seem to be falling apart. Now, I'm figuratively, or
Yeah.
in some cases, perhaps literally. But again, that's back to setting the priorities. We happen to picking on the Parks Department now, but that's and again, it had, just like everyone's been saying, it presumably weighed against everything else in other departments. But
yeah, I mean, and just to, get back to the, a fleet replacement schedule, there is a schedule, but we also review equipment on an annual basis to see whether or not it should be moved up, or can we go a couple of years without replacing it. I think with the Parks Department, the truck that you're referring to, I think there were several pictures showing the Swiss cheese-like nature of the body of that truck, was scheduled for replacement the next fiscal year. So we moved it forward one fiscal year, and I'm not going to get into physics and things like that, but having a Parks Department located right on the Sound does not do wonders for the equipment exposed to that lovely salty air.
yeah,
And there have been instances where we have been able to get an extra year or two out of certain vehicles, and we try to do that because we do want to maximize the use of the vehicles, while still maintaining some level of value when we dispose of them.
Yeah, I would, encourage that, not understanding state legal mandates, and with that, likely being behind us with legal obligations having been met, hopefully.
Yeah.
And that's behind us.
And
But to pick up now, kind of for whatever reason, 2 years in a row, and there's probably a multitude of reasons, the capital budget was not adopted. So it's 2 years in a row of that. Ideally, it gets adopted next year, but it is what it is right now. And now we have time to take something like the capital budget in plan, which, if that is allowed to be, I'm all about transparency, allowed to be posted into the document as an addendum, and that's not conflicting with the title of the document saying adopted.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's ways of dealing with that.
Charles, it is incorporated into the budget document. And I don't know, have you ever seen the capital improvement project forms that department heads fill out?
Yes.
I have, and Augie also had briefly shared during a prior meeting what I think is what you're going to share with us, which I think is what the capital budget and plan sounds like it is, which was, for me at least, and I think other people on the call, was much more reflective of what we were envisioning in terms of the consolidated format, condensed by underlying priority criteria, and that being able to see that, understand how it was arrived at, and if there's the need to kind of work through it, particularly if it's spread over a 5-year period with moving targets, that we all have something to be referencing and working off of, and kind of seeing what was assumed to be the target to get done this year.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a great starting point to have that, and then it can be dynamic. I mean, I think that even if a capital budget were approved there's still flexibility and probably the need to be dynamic and, are being, engaged in understanding it and being able to work with it, I think would be
Yeah,
a part of what we're involved with.
yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting to be here tonight, so I'm not at work with my access to my computer. But the format of the capital budget, the first column is the project. The second column is the department undertaking the project. I believe the third column is the priority. The fourth through ninth columns are the year it's budgeted for. And then the remaining columns are the scoring columns where values are assigned, weighted values are assigned to the project, which helps delineate, determine the overall project score, which helps determine the overall priority.
Right, but I think what we're getting at, Dan, and we discussed this at the last meeting. And unfortunately, whoever the board liaison is supposed to bring back our questions, concerns asked to the board. So, it's the second meeting, Tom's not hearing this. But I think our overall concern is that we go through this huge planning cycle and we don't have a current fiscal year approved capital plan.
Hmm.
You guys spend a whole lot of time pulling together the 5-year plan and prioritizing it and ranking it and meeting with the department heads and, coming to your agreement, and it doesn't get approved.
All right, well, let me start off by sending you the latest capital budget document tomorrow morning.
Okay.
Okay.
And look, again, it's behind us now, unfortunately. But I just feel, I would be remiss to not, make it part of the dialogue throughout the year to understand, what is preventing there being some form of consensus or adherence to process to be able to get something approved formally and submitted.
Well, I mean, and I think
State.
it's really, I think what I'm envisioning, and I think what you're envisioning is it's a two-tiered approval process. The first approval is the capital budget and the plan, and then the second approvals are when we're ready to implement the project to get the funding.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
But we would like to
you know,
have, I'm sorry, Charles, when the operating budget
go ahead.
approved, an approval for whether it be the 5-year plan or year one of that 5-year plan, or X projects, specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I would lean more towards the plan because, just because a project takes place in year 3 doesn't mean we're doing all the legwork in year 3.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just clarify, because I was taking notes on something that I think you said earlier. I just want to make sure I'm correct. Let's go back to the infamous playground equipment example.
Okay.
Let's say the capital plan is in the capital plan. It has priority number 1 for the Parks Department is to spend $100,000 on playground equipment. I'm just picking a number out of the air.
Okay.
Okay. Now then I thought I heard you say, Dan, is that what you do when we approaching, that board approval is you get quotes on the project, send the board is made aware of those quotes, and presumably if it's consistent or with the capital plan, then the board approves going to design. Once the design is complete, it then goes back to the board for final approval. Because at that point, presumably you have final
Well,
cost.
yeah, I mean, again, you also, it's final cost plus if there are construction contracts, anything, there are bid thresholds that upon which the Board of Trustees is required to award certain.
Okay, what I described, is that an accurate description of the process?
I would say that's fairly accurate.
Okay, fairly. Where did I mess up?
Well, I mean, every project can be a little bit different.
Yeah,
For
sure.
instance, if we're buying something off state contract, usually there are more soup to nuts options in terms of design, and then, construction. Because we can get a bid, we can do everything under one contract. Whereas opposed, if we don't have a contract, we have to, pay for someone to do the design. Then we have to, we have to be awarded ahead of time, and then you would have to have a separate award for when you do the contract. So, but that's why I say it's a fairly accurate description.
All right. So, okay, I was just trying to get a sense of the number of times it goes back, or the board is aware of this and have to take some action, which presumably takes time. That's all. So there's a number in the capital plan. The board presumably reviews the capital plan, and if they were adopting a capital budget, that would be one and the same. You approve the budget for year one, and then the out years show other projects. Then, you get the quotes, then you do the design, and then you return to the board. So the board touches it in some form 3 times.
Well, they're going to see it when we talked about it during the budget season, which they did.
Yeah.
If we need to, hire someone to do engineering work, they're going to see it at that point. And then they're going to see it at the point of making an award. For a piece of equipment, they're going to see it when during the budget presentation, and then they'll see it again when we come back to them for a furnish and deliver request.
Is there, and this might be an Augie question, but is there an underlying cash flow model behind the consolidated capital budget and plan that you're aware of being used?
I think that's part and parcel of some of the recommendations that have been made about, what percent of the budget should be dedicated to our debt, and we do try to we do manage our debt. We know, we do have debt schedules, so we know when we're going to be experiencing increases and decreases in our annual debt service, and we do try to maintain a certain level because once this is a tax cap world, and right now capital investment is not exempt from the tax cap calculation. So, when
Yeah, I've seen the debt schedules, which are really quite developed and quite sophisticated, and I would love to be able to understand them better at some point in my life. And Augie is clearly, as I'm sure you are, very adept. I know he's the guru with that, and with that, to your point, using that as part of the planning process is super valuable and super critical. But then with it being very, with the capital budget and plan, and again, I love the consolidated nature of it, the formatting. Like that's again what I would have been envisioning, some version of that. And then with those debt schedules as an underlying cash flow component, but then the cash flow being developed for the capital budget and plan, I think would round it out. And maybe Augie has that, but I imagine it's very difficult when nothing was adopted and it's basically something that you're using in plan to then develop a comprehensive cash flow model, might be, you're in a holding pattern waiting to see whether you should be doing that. But if I were trying to determine based on a recommended, debt service number and, pick the number of what you were targeting to spend for the year. And if somebody said, I don't want you to go over $8 to $10 million, but I really don't want you to come up significantly short either, because we want to get the work done and I don't want to see you only spending 3, I would find it extremely difficult to be able to make decisions about moving forward with projects without the underlying cash flow model at my disposal to know where I stood and then to be able to track going forward. So
Yeah.
I would love to see that, like, if that exists, but also we're talking as part 2 tonight as to what some of the, areas of focus throughout the upcoming year could be for us. Selfishly, because I care about it, but also as an education process to just be a part of contributing to that if it's not being done. I want to put that out there as, something to propose that we engage in, or that if Augie is engaging in it, that if we can be of any help in participating analytically or what have you. But I think that's critical to being able to execute.
The other thing we discussed a couple of meetings back, which is kind of in line with that, Charles, is when the final proposed budget is being presented to the board, that there be, a summary page or 2 of the recommended projects that be done in that fiscal year and why those projects are selected and what the fiscal impact is of that year and then potentially future years.
So you're talking
Which
about
kind of looped it in.
a narrative statement along with the capital.
Well, except I'm saying pull out of, let's say there are $20 million worth of priority 1 projects. We know we're not going to spend 20 million in a given year. So I'm assuming you, Jerry, Augie, the department heads, whittle that 20 million down to a manageable number. So that whittled down project list be presented as, this is what we're recommending we work on in the next fiscal year. And this is the financial impact of these projects. So that it all gets approved at the same time as the operating plan.
Okay, I understand. I mean, that's, but what I envision, I think this is what the town of Mamaroneck had typically done, is when they present their capital budget, they would have an accompanying written document that would set forth the capital priorities for that year, along with a description of the project. And you could probably, have what the total cost of the capital is. What we don't do and that's a larger question. We don't necessarily have a direct cash transfer to the capital fund. So most of the items are either scheduled to be purchased through debt, grants, or some sort of special reserve, whether it be PEG funding or the Parkland Recreation Fund. We could probably do that's part of the capital improvement form, and we do have some identification about recommended funding sources in the capital budget document, but perhaps there could be a better tracking of the recommendation for those funding sources. So we could break it down even further, say, we're recommending to spend $10 million, $5 million is funded through grant awards, $3 million is funded through the issuance of debt. And, $1 million is, from special reserves, and $500,000 is from, capital fund balance or other cash contribution. Is that kind of what you're thinking is along the same lines as well, or am I a little off?
Kind of. Kind of. I just think let's back up. A couple of years ago, we had nothing on capital plans. So we've made huge progress. You guys have made huge progress on this. But I really think it's got to be somewhat overwhelming to the board. It's not a criticism of the board. There's so much in that 5-year plan that I think it's up to Jerry, you, Augie, department heads to put in front of the board, this is what we need to do in the next fiscal year.
Yeah.
This is what it's going to cost. And then to your point, out of the total cost, we're getting grants for, 55% or, whatever it is. But, then bring in, to Charles' point, what that cash flow is. What does that actually mean to the dollars out of our operating budget?
Mhm.
And I
Well,
think that this brings it all together, and the board can then make a decision. So when you're doing project by project, let's go back to the playground. They already know that conceptually they've approved doing that playground this year. So all they're now approving is the details of that playground.
So, and my philosophy behind the budget document is it's really, obviously it's numbers, but it's a teaching tool for people to understand
Yep.
how their government works. It's not a, I think the worst type of budget is, which is part of what we do in most budgets, is 300 pages of spreadsheets.
So, in a previous life, I used to manage a $400 million technology budget. And a lot of that, it was staff and equipment. So it was a lot of what the village is dealing with, it's staff and equipment.
Yeah.
And we had the same constraints. You can't have the world all at one time. And I used to put together stuff for the executive committee member to approve our spending, and just I didn't need to be offensive to him, but I was basically dumbing down this huge list.
Yeah.
To basically say, this is what you need to focus on,
Yeah.
without telling him this is what you need to focus on. I'm
Sure.
happy to, if it will help you, Dan, because I know what's in my head and I may not be explaining it. I'm happy to put together a template of what I'm thinking and send it to you if that will help.
Okay.
All right, so let me make a note that I volunteered to do that.
I think from what I'm hearing, and I have a slightly different take on this. What Dan said is we have set, quote, priorities. And if you looked at the form, it describes the funding source,
Yep,
be it grant or the village. Okay, so now in order to produce the cash flows, now in theory, you have to say, let's say we've got 10 projects for the sake of argument. Now, are all 10 going to be completed in 1 year? Or are some of those going to extend over multiple years? Now, the ones that are completed in 1 year, the cash flow is easy because you say, some point in the fiscal year, we're going to buy a truck. It's going to cost us $50,000. We're going to take the cash out of the reserve, and Augie's going to fund it through debt service when he does it once a year. That's how I understand it's done.
Yeah, that's how we do it.
Yes. Okay. So those projects, it's less relevant, the cash flow, because you're gonna spend all the cash in 1 year and then you're gonna take it out with debt. Okay. The other more complicated ones are multi-year projects where you have a huge project, I don't know, a seawall or the rebuilding of the village hall, which is 3 or 5 years. Okay. Now, the question becomes, if there's a decision to rebuild Village Hall, that is taken and spread over multiple years in the capital plan. So if you say
So,
design is in year 1, then presumably the goal is to complete design in year 1 and spend that money and then fund it through debt service. Am I describing multi?
that's correct. And, and many projects I can talk like that. Are very simple.
So the key becomes how accurate, and this is a function of experience and so on, how accurate the projections are in terms of the project timing.
Yeah, so,
And if I could just finish this, then I think that's the key now. You'll be right on some and wrong on others. And as Charles said, okay, so it's a dynamic document, but it's important to keep track of how much at least you expend each year.
yeah,
I'm talking about, I think, Charles, correct me if I'm wrong, we're not talking about a monthly cash flow, simply because we're funding everything out of reserves until it's taken out with debt.
Yep.
So
And-
then it becomes how much cash do you expect to spend in each year, which should be consistent with the capital budget.
yeah.
Right, and
the
if
way-
we're
the way
saying-
capital budgets work, and I don't want to sound like I'm dumbing it down too much.
You can, it's okay.
No, a capital budget really isn't calculated on a fiscal year. It's calculated on the project life. A capital budget appropriation exists until it's either spent or decommitted. So if a board says, here's the capital project to replace the Hillside Avenue Bridge, they're not going to appropriate $3 million 1 year for construction and then $2 million the next year. The project gets $5 million, the capital budget account, and that's spent over the life cycle of that project.
Okay.
Right, but Dan, so let me ask a question
That's
to
very
that
important.
point.
That's very important.
Yeah,
So.
Yeah, so if we're saying, I'm gonna make up a number, we can take on 6 million in debt every year. Whether it replaces existing debt or, we can comfortably do that. So if we're approving the bridge, so year 1 is 3 million, which leaves us 3 million more for other projects for that annual debt. But when I go into next year, I've already used 2 of that 6 that's available.
but that's why you kind of look at it as, what you're authorizing up front. We're not authorizing X number of dollars each year. We authorize it when we award the contract.
Right, but then the notion of cash flow becomes very important.
Critical.
Because if you don't appropriate the amount to be spent in the year and you do it all at once, even though it's a multi-year project, behind the scenes or something you have to say is, well, we're only going to be able to do 3 million out of 5 million in year 1, and we'll do year 2, we'll do the 2 million. So
It doesn't,
Charles's point becomes.
we don't stop, we typically don't stop capital projects.
Sure, of course.
We're not
Of
saying
course.
that.
Of course
We're
not.
just saying the next year you don't have that full 6
Well-
million, whatever that number is, to spend on new projects because you've already committed 2 million of it for an existing project.
or if you count everything in that year. So instead of counting 3 and 2 and 3 million one year, 2 million the next year, you count 5 million in the first year
No,
or the
Well,
project.
counting is the operative word, you know, counting in terms of whether the project is going to be undertaken and as part of a
because-
list is one thing, but counted in terms of the cash flow and whether with your targeted, you know, debt service, you're able to undertake additional projects that you would like to. That's where the cash flow
Yeah.
model becomes the necessary tool
Yeah, but we're not,
to know where to be able to draw the line.
yeah, but you know, if we have a $5 million project, we spend $3 million one year, $2 million the next year. We're not going to have a separate bond issue each year we're not going to count that 3 million in one year's bond issue and the 2 million in another year's bond issue. That's all going to be bonded at the same time, that project cost.
Right, but the decision as to whether to bond it is predicated on whether taking on that debt service and the impact to your
no,
Debt
but
service.
what Dan just
Number.
said is critical.
Yeah, I'll
If we're doing 100% of the bond at one time instead of split, the cash flow has the cost of that. So Dan, would we do the 5 million at the beginning or at the end?
At the end, because what we
At the
do, what we do is we,
Okay.
we fund it through the fund balance first, then we'll reimburse the fund balance. That way, the reason we do that is because we like to consolidate our bond issues because there are, significant costs for each separate bond issue you do. That could be, so,
All right,
You know what?
so but that's also good to know, because again, let's assume we could take on 6 million in new debt each year. This 2-year project is gonna be bonded at the end of the 2 years for 5 million. That only leaves 1 million left in new projects to be bonded for that year.
again, we'd have to see how it works in
Yeah.
the overall.
But I
That's
think
it.
that's where this cash flow becomes critical.
I think the,
I don't think it's cash flow, though.
well,
We're taking money out of the reserves. We're not taking cash out of the budget.
No, we
So-
are when we bond it.
No, but there we're taking out, the interest on the bond.
Right.
yeah,
And if all these bonds, 5 years, 2 years, 3, I mean,
Or
it just
multiple.
depends. But that's a different issue when you're talking about, oh, do we have enough money for this project? It's not, I don't.
I think it's more an issue. I think and Charles, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're looking at it more from, are we able to absorb the new debt when we go out to debt based on what we have outstanding? Are we gonna have enough money to pay the new debt service?
Yeah, because like if you took Village Hall as an example, and if on one list or spreadsheet, you're listing the total value of the project that you're intending on undertaking and bonding in some capacity, and I think what you're saying is would you bond the full 10 million in that year? Or if it was a 5-year horizon, would you do it in increments? I mean, that's just a question, but knowing where to draw that line based on some of the parameters that we've talked about in terms of what the percentage of debt service should be, a percentage of the operating budget, all of those metrics, to know where to draw that line, having those other models with the debt service number and other interest carry numbers is going to help you know where to draw the line. Whereas if you just have the one list and there's 5 projects that total $30 million over their life, it's very hard to know what you can do in that year across those other criteria.
And the Village Hall project's a good example. If that's 12 to 15 million and we're gonna bond it all at one time, that's gonna have a huge impact on our debt service if we don't prepare for that up front and, scale back in prior years.
Or you try to schedule it in accordance with your overall debt service schedule.
Yep.
Yeah, I think and I think Ed raised a good point. It seems, correct me if I'm wrong again, Dan, sorry, we're jumping all over jumping on you here, but it seems that in prior years, most prior years, as at least the documents have shown, is the board has adopted a capital budget, but we have actually executed and spent very little of that total.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of over the last 20 years, I'm sure some of the capital budgets were, very aggressive.
Yes, okay, but the point is now, it's clear, at least it seems to us, that you guys now are much more aggressive about the village's capital needs and plan to be aggressive, rightly so, given, because I saw that email from Jerry about, on the flood meeting there about, how the village is going to be doing a lot of construction in the future. And there's a lot going on now if you just drive around. But my point is that the issues that are being raised here become much more important if we're going to plan on spending multiples of what we spent on capital in prior years. Because what that does, presumably, is puts pressure on the reserves. And we want to maintain our reserve policy, but also puts pressure on debt service and cash flow and so on, perhaps. So I think the issues that we're raising perhaps were less relevant, quite frankly, in prior years. But at least it seems to us, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to us is that you guys, thankfully, are much more aggressive about, not letting the village infrastructure fall apart.
Yeah.
And which I think is great. And, but again, we have to balance that against the finances. So that's why I think the issue we're trying to bring to the fore here become more critical.
Absolutely. And it's also the intersection of policy. It's really the intersection of, fiscal policy and, what our capital needs are. How much we're going to spend.
And given Len's point, we can revisit with Tom, which is really appropriate. But item 2 on the agenda tonight, was to talk about some of the things that we focus on, and as we have an operating budget, a capital budget, other projects that we've talked about engaging on, and we have frameworks that we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years developing, which I think to some degree are being utilized and referenced. I raised that the capital budget not being adopted, that's behind us. We've looked at schedule and the budget process schedule, and that it's challenging and it's been worked with, and it was changed per some of the proposals that we had put forth. That gets tough to be involved with at this point. And, hopefully we can keep touching on that and try to figure out how, going into the next year's cycle, we can try to figure out why this wasn't adopted and to have next year's adopted. But in the meantime, I would propose that, to Len's point, given all of these, you can see it around you, it's just bursting with activity in the village, that are being, engaged, probably with you and Augie, Dan, with what we've talked about tonight with some of these mechanics, and participating in it live with what's on the table, I think would be a really productive use of the committee's time for the upcoming year. And we can see if Tom would agree with that, but do you guys agree that, some of it's very complex, and, I know Augie has a very good command of a lot of that, but, maybe he could provide feedback how we could be of some use with,
Yeah, I mean, I think,
but it's some,
the mission of the budget committee, which was, I think, established in the resolution that created it, was really to, assist the village manager and staff to identify efficiencies, ways to, make things work better in the village. It's been a while since I reviewed the mission, but I think that's a bit of a overly didactic explanation, or overly simplified. But that's the purpose. That was the mission that the board set forth for the budget committee, was to assist the manager and the staff to identify these types of efficiencies.
When Jerry first joined the village, he had a couple of things for us to work on, which, we happily did.
Yeah.
We helped with the procurement policy. We looked at the recovery rate for, police working on construction projects. There were a couple of things that we did, and then it's kind of dried up,
Yeah.
so we're
Right.
here.
Honestly, I think between, we are devoting a majority of our time to some of these existing capital projects we have out there right now. The sewer project, dominates Jerry's time. Dealing with, the bridge and the various grant applications for capital projects dominates my time. I don't have the
Bandwidth.
bandwidth that I did maybe 5 years ago.
Okay, so let me throw an idea out to you. One of the things Len and I were discussing when we were working on the operating budget framework, our recommendations, utilizing the term fixed costs, or costs that we can't control. Like, for example, our staff costs. And, Len and I had a conversation. So, we have X number in a department. Have we done any kind of, and this is a global we, any kind of analysis in terms of what makes sense per department from a fixed headcount perspective versus overtime? So if we look at, Glenn's not here, but he always says we never seem to budget enough for overtime. So let's look at the police department, for example. Maybe it makes sense to hire more police and reduce the amount of overtime. There's got to be a break-even point. And maybe in the DPW, it makes more sense to do more overtime, because that's driven in part, by storms.
Yeah.
Winter storms and fewer staff. Has anyone done that kind of analysis?
I think, is this two separate analysis? One would be to identify the proper complement, and then just a separate overtime analysis, or
It's
more just
combined.
the overtime analysis?
I think it's kind of combined.
We've done various studies of our municipal operations over the years. Most recently, we did one for building department. We did one for sanitation before that. We've done, I think we had the Bratton report from, was it 2007, 2008, which looked at the police department operations. Um, you know, as far as an overtime analysis, and on the police side, it gets a little more complicated just because, as you talked, I don't want to get bogged down in specifics. This is more of a global question. And, you know, there's always idiosyncrasies to each calculation.
Yep.
With the police department, the big one being what is the reimbursable and what is, you know, the non-reimbursable overtime. You know, that unfortunately, you know, we don't, in our payroll system, it's not delineated between, you know, the reimbursable and non-reimbursable. So that's a separate spreadsheet that we maintain. And we do see, especially with the level of capital work, and just that money that's just going through the roof right now. We are in the process of hiring a number of police officers. We're actually, I think, down something like between vacancies, retire, you know, out injured. We're down to like 6 officers right now. So, you know, we are looking to hire a whole new crop, which, you know, has advantages and disadvantages in terms of cash flow. Obviously, they're coming in at a lower part of the salary scale. So we realize savings for several years. But on the other hand, if they have to go to the academy, we're paying them. They're part of our complement, but they're not here. So we got to backfill the positions. So it's
To Ellen's point, and back to mine as well, with item 2 on the agenda for it again. I think we all were in agreement last month that it's really appropriate for Tom to be here for,
yeah, I mean,
you know, our resolving what our focus is going to be. But with my suggestion regarding, call it cash flow, debt service, underlying analytics, and then, you know, Augie's feedback, whether, you know, is that going to get too complex? You know, you know, to your point, Dan, you know, your response was that, you know, I think it was that with respect to what our mission statement is, that would probably be in line with, you know, why we're here. And is it appropriate for us to engage with that level of complexity and detailed analytics? I selfishly would, it's very important to me. I think it's a very live issue with momentum in the village with all the projects going on. And it would certainly be one hell of an education process, and something I think a lot of people on this call would be good at contributing toward, given different skill sets. So if we could have that as a conversation or you know, a motion when Tom's here, maybe is one of the things to look at. And then to Ellen's suggestion, given fixed costs being just such an embedded part of, and large percentage of the operating budget, and oftentimes feeling like because they're fixed and inflexible that there's not much to do with them. I think Ellen's raising a really interesting analysis that might be undertaken, would be to, you know, to look at, you know, cost benefit of overtime versus hires, and understanding those numbers across multiple departments. You know, so those are two.
yeah, I mean,
That was Len's idea, not mine. So let's give credit where it's due.
yes, as far as the fixed cost, I think it's basically, you know, composed of 2 factors. It's labor, it's salary and benefits. And
Yep.
the benefits to the service, I refer to them as the non-departmental, because that's, you know, village wide, and, you know, that's things like our health insurance, our pension, our workers' comp, our insurance. You know, that's where the nice guys at the state of New York say, here's your bill for health insurance this year, here's your bill for pension this year. Our workers' comp carrier says, here's your workers' comp bill this year, and same thing with the insurance. So it gets a little, you know, that's I think we say it's like 80% of our costs are really fixed costs, according to your definition, Ellen. I mean, if it's basically salary.
And we don't have to map out the whole year, but, you know, those are 2 pretty, you know, involved things that we could get started with. I don't know that we, if a motion would be appropriate to discuss it with Tom, or we can just
Well,
make the note that
yeah, I mean, I
when,
think
when
that,
we're on with Tom to talk this through, and if any other suggestions are out there, that we talk about them and then try to map out the year before too many months go by without us being kind of turned loose with specific
yeah,
areas of focus.
from a philosophical perspective, and I think the budget committee is the exception to the rule, because it explicitly states, that the manager can work with you. Usually, advisory committees are committee advisory to the board of trustees, and the board of trustees would usually say, we want you to look at A, B, C, and D. But I think, again, the budget committee, because of your charge being expressly stated about who and your mission, it's a little different. So I think it's really conversations with Tom, or your liaison, and then Jerry is the manager.
Yeah, and the board. I mean, we're here to serve the village and the staff and the board. And, again, it's almost, we all felt like it wasn't even really appropriate to get into this without Tom on.
Yeah.
So, we'll pick it up with him, get his feedback. If anybody else has other things, suggestions, in the meantime or now. I had one thing I just wanted to pull up, and, not to, obviously, prioritization has been a big theme. And I'm sorry, let me just, can you see the Excel spreadsheet, or am I on the wrong screen?
Yeah, no, I see it says department criteria, state criteria, total.
Yeah. So I would just like to, as I've said numerous times, I mean, the sophistication of the department criteria process it's really thoroughly developed, and there's tons of time that goes into it, and to utilize it and understand it, which I think is critical, whether it be the board understanding it, the public understanding it. I don't fully understand it. And, this is the concept that I don't understand, which is if a department head weights something, and let's say 10 is the highest criteria and 1 is the lowest, and you take the item and a department head says it's a 10 and the state is saying it's a 3, it's going to have a weight of 30. But then if there's an item that the department head says is a 1, low priority, but the state's saying it's super important, it's going to have a weight of a 10. So we would be moving forward in this scenario with this project that the state is saying is of low priority, but the department head or heads in aggregate are saying is a high priority. So I don't understand how this is being used, and how this isn't necessarily outweighing state criteria, which under one of the criteria are law.
So I think what I like about the ranking system that we are using is it's both quantitative, but allows for a qualitative element as well. I'm not, I wouldn't just necessarily rely on, I think, let's just say our priority rankings can allow for overall numbers of 1 to 1,000. With 1,000, the more points, obviously, the higher, the more points the project has, the more important it is. I still think that we don't just rely on that alone as the only item for which we establish our priorities. you know, if it's something like routine maintenance, routine, and I'm not, I'm just gonna use one item as an example, but you know, this could be different among different items. Um, You know, we're looking to replace, you know, our rolling stock. We try to replace one garbage truck every 2 years. You know, it's a fairly standard item, but I also know that if we don't replace that item on a like a regular basis, you know, we're gonna be stuck with aging equipment that gets beat up, and it's gonna be less, you know, less reliable the longer we have it. So even though it's a routine replacement, you know, I may look at that as a higher priority just in order to maintain the integrity of our fleet, and we have that ability to, you know, include that type of qualitative assessment in our prioritization.
I think, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, Charles, but I was a bit perplexed, a little confused, I mean. The state criteria presumably, at least in what I'm thinking, reflects sort of the sample that the controller had
Yep.
in the state controller
Yeah,
document.
and
And in that are suggestions. Now, when we set our capital planning document to the board, you may recall we discussed the high priority projects down to what would be the lowest. And Ed and I had a back and forth about should legal, you know, requirements, I'll use that term, or court decisions, take a higher priority over the health and safety of village employees and village residents. And I think we ended up saying, well, life, health, and safety is a higher priority. And we ranked 4 or 5 things. Now, that was acceptable to the controller because I believe the document said, well, you know, here are some things that, you know, but you guys decide essentially. So, I think if you look at the capital plan document, there are more criteria than actually we had suggested. Now, so there's a degree of discretion that the village has with respect to establishing its criteria. And it seems the key element here is to be internally consistent. And that, you know, you don't treat, you know, health and safety in one department. If there's danger to employees, you don't say, well, we need a truck as opposed to correcting the danger to the employees. I'm obviously being extreme. So I'm quite frankly not troubled by the criteria or the village criteria, as a, you know, presumably the department and the village are the same thing. We're internally consistent, but what then becomes the challenge is saying across multiple departments, an issue that you brought up, Charles, which I think is the key issue, is does a number 1 or a 10-pointer in Department A get a higher priority in terms of the village budget, the ability to execute and so on, than a high priority in Department B?
Right, but that's where the template that I'm gonna put together comes into play.
Yeah.
Why is this project more important than another project?
Yeah,
It's
and I
not
think
every
that's-
department gets a project.
But I don't know, Charles, if I'm reading what you said correctly.
Well, I have a basic
You
question,
you are
Charles.
go ahead, Ed. Yep.
But I don't understand it. It appears to me that the department criteria and the state criteria, they're being multiplied. I'm assuming the state they're multiplying each other to get to a total. Why are they being multiplied instead of added? Why is it a multiplication?
Well, you know, it's, it's worth up to, um, like each, so if it's, let's say it's a legal requirement, you can get it to 10 points, but that 10 points is, you can make it 1 through 10, but it's gonna say, if it's a legal requirement, it's worth like 60% of the overall score. So I think we've tried to assign prioritization within those categories as to what is more important than another category. It's kind of a complicated way. It's like trying to explain.
We have three.
Go right ahead, Charles.
Yeah, there's a few things. Yeah, so Ed, I actually think you actually make a great point. I just threw this together quickly. I don't know in the, the criteria numbers that are, I don't know how Jerry's model works in terms of how it gets weighted. But yeah, I think to your point, it actually, because now you've tripled versus this would be 13 to 11, which is closer. That's probably a great point. I was trying to just demonstrate that if the state criteria are ultimately, if the projects are evaluated across state criteria, let's say by the staff and the board with some degree of objectivity, but then you have greater risk of lack of objectivity with department heads assigning weights, not understanding that their rankings should be in line with the state or the document that we prepared weights. There's room for, you have 10 department heads who don't necessarily understand the rankings, putting a 10 for something that's really important to them. And then that could lead to, if it's extreme, like the example I presented here, that project getting done if that department head's weight supersedes the state criteria. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's understanding, I'm not sure how Jerry's weight system works across these two criteria.
What I'll do is, let me see if I can send you, I don't want to send you an editable version of the capital budget document that we have, but if I can send you like a version of it to explain how it'll show you how the rankings are determined, how the points are allotted. So you can take a look at it and see how that works.
Okay, I mean, do you know offhand in that case, like, are both being used with weights to arrive at an aggregate number?
The answer is yes. So, but again, I don't have it in front of me, so I don't want to try and picture it in my mind's eye and not give you an accurate description of how the scores are calculated. So let me take a look at it, and I will, send you something, and I will try to answer or give you the question for the answer, like a math word problem, which is very, sometimes very difficult.
And then obviously policing, if you were evaluating the criteria that are assigned across both, because it can get subjective. The state guidelines are very clear, but if somebody says that project X, according to state guidelines, is not a 1 but a 5, it's whoever's assigning these doing it accurately, and that could be off on the state side or on the department head side.
Yeah,
so it's being participatory in terms of evaluating that.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and then
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was Ellen or Len to the other piece, which would get complex, is if you have multiple departments that are, coming in tied, what the process is in terms of evaluating which department is given the precedent over another. I don't know if that was your point, Len, or Ellen's, and then there was a third point, I believe. Len, what was your question again as to whether
Well,
I was in agreement with what you were focusing on?
yeah, really, I mean, first of all, whether I give much less weight to what the controller had, because they, in the document, as I recall, saying, the village or locality has discretion.
Yeah,
I understand your point now, Charles, better, because what I'm doing, but that is, so I place much less emphasis on that. What I'm looking at the capital plan now, the 21 to 26 plan. Now I get your point, Charles, at least in terms of the score, the multiplication. I'm looking at the village, we, in our document, which is right there in this document, that we had 5 criteria. The village, the projects were ranked against 7. And for example, Municity, the building department, 5, whatever that is that a system?
yeah. It's a
All right,
computer system.
so they got a rating of 3 under operational impact, with in that criterion has a weight of 7. So the score is calculated multiplying 3 times 7. Then on criterion 7, which is maintenance, maintains and improve the quality of infrastructure, the rating is 5. The weight of that particular criterion is less. It's of a less priority, and the weight is 3. So 5 times 3 is 15. So the project score is 21 plus 15 gives us 36. Okay, that's clear. But what's much less clear is how the rating is established, and the weights clearly assign priority to the various criteria. The weights for consent order and health and safety are the same. They're 15. So that's okay. So those are the 2 most important criteria. Then it goes down from 9 all the way down to 3, which is what we just discussed. So the math is, I understand the math. The table is confusing, quite frankly, because it doesn't sort the documents from highest to lowest.
So,
That's
well, I think you'll see, we made some, in what we produced for the board this year, we did make some
Oh, thank you.
amended it, so we changed it up a bit. So
Okay.
I can, no, that's what we did this year. We, has the department head priority. And then we separated by departments. I mean, that's how I was asked to show it. So I only showed it the way I was asked to show it. I didn't show it by overall priorities. I was asked to show it by the departments. They could see the rankings within the department. I didn't want to, have 3 or 4 separate formats of the capital budget.
Okay, if you scroll to the right,
Yep.
now scroll, all right, so here's where we are. Okay, the last column, project scores.
Yeah, the overall project scores.
Now look, the numbers are all over the place. In theory, you could sort this spreadsheet, which would have the highest score on the top and the lowest scores on the bottom. and back to Ellen's template, you'd say, okay, we can afford, you'd have to know the cost, we can afford the top 50 projects. I'm just picking a number. Because these rank in terms of our priorities, and these are the top 50, and let's do them. I'm being simplistic, I understand. Because not only is it important that you set priorities, but you can actually execute the projects during the course of the year or multiple years. So at least it seems that the bones are certainly there for a really good process. What's confusing is looking at, 100 lines on a page and trying to figure out, absent the narrative, what's clarity, nor does it get down to saying, here are the top projects. These are the ones we want to do. Based upon our scoring system. Or
I also, that's what I mentioned, I think, there needs to be a qualitative element in addition to the quantitative element. Because, a certain project may not have a highest score, but because of, other non-scored items may be more important from an operational perspective.
So Dan, where does this ranking come from? So if we look at the column that says department head priority,
Yep,
we've got things that are priority 1, 2, and 3, and 4, all with a 10 ranking. So where does this come from?
no, the department heads assign those rankings themselves when reviewing their projects.
I think you mean the rating, Ellen.
No, go,
First column.
That one?
yeah, rating. Okay, it's small print. What?
Again, I think that's part of the qualitative element. If you look at, the building department, the pool vehicles, what it doesn't say here is, we don't need to replace the vehicles because we're under consent order. Health and safety, vehicle's a vehicle. But, we have a couple of 15-year-old Ford Focuses that are being driven by our building department. Having reliable vehicles may not have as high a score, but from an operational perspective, it's probably more important.
No, but
having-
I'm confused that ratings seem to
I mean, if you're
be
if
a
you're
10 when a
suggesting that-
priority is 6.
Is the suggestion that that everything be ranked by its project score and not have a qualitative element along?
No,
with it, or
no,
not?
that's not what I'm saying. Within a given department, I don't understand if they've set their priority, why things have a priority of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, but the rating's all 10. Because
Because
then
the
they're not
overall,
distinguishing.
but
anything.
that seems like you're saying that like if you look at those two building department projects, one has a score of 81, one has a score of 173. You're asking why the one with 173 isn't the number one priority for the building department. That's
To Ellen's point, I don't understand how this works. You have priorities.
no,
One through,
but it seems like the question is why are we not ranking the projects in accordance with their project score?
No, that's
no,
not what my question is.
before we get to that column,
This is
just,
my point.
you have priorities in this first column.
Yeah, those are assigned
Right,
by
so
the department.
Right, so the street sweeper is a 1, high priority.
Yep,
That gets a 10, right?
okay.
And then a 4 gets a 10.
That's my question.
How is the rating set?
Yeah,
But, well, I think it's
Yeah,
set by-
I don't understand how this works. I mean, maybe if the spreadsheet had the formulas, but
well, it's also, this isn't the entire spreadsheet. it doesn't show the year of funding request. So that may be,
Before we jump into, and maybe if you don't know this, we don't have to get into it now, but like, how is this rating assigned off of the priority?
no, the priority is based on the project score, which is the quantitative element. Is that understood?
No,
Okay,
Look,
so
you have a one, you have a
I'm really, I don't think we're on the same page right now, and I'm trying to.
If a priority of 1 is set and the
Yep.
rating is a 10.
Yep.
Versus a priority of 4 being set and the rating is a 10. The priorities are differing, but the ratings are not.
Okay, but again, I think there are other columns which may deal with the year that they're being.
But before we get into all that, that's the question: is why with different priorities are the ratings the same?
I'd have to ask the department head about each individual project to get an answer on that. I don't have that answer right now off the top of my head. But the department heads, look at all their capital requests, and they rank them across the category.
It just logically doesn't seem like it would make sense if you are giving something a different priority that you would
But
give it
again, I think that's where,
the same weight.
as I've said, and that there's a quantitative and a qualitative element to the ranking, not just, you're saying, why does this have a project score of this, but it has, a ranking of 4, that's a same project score as a ranking of 1.
Dan, maybe you can take us through one of these or a couple of them that we're talking about.
I don't have,
How you get to the number at the end. That's what I don't.
So if you scroll down to
I can't see the number at the end because the Zoom is putting the pictures over that column.
Okay, so if you look at criterions 1 through 7, there's a weight for each item and then a rating for each item. So for instance, if you look at line under the consent order, you go to sewer flow monitoring equipment. That's a 10. We have a consent order. Under the public health, on the health, that's a 10. That sewers that's public health issues. If you scroll back out, I can't see what the heading for column 3 is.
Dan,
No.
just so, who assigns the rating numbers?
The department head,
The department head assigns the rating numbers.
yes.
Okay, so the
And we
department
look it
head-
over, and if we go,
the department head set the priorities and assign the rating against each of the criteria. Okay,
they assign the rating in terms of the ranking of the projects throughout all their projects. I mean, that's confusing, but again,
well, the capital plan that I have in front of me says, let's see, projects will be populated from blah, blah, blah. Consider each option, each criterion for each project and assign a rating from 1 to 10 on how well it meets that criterion. So I guess that was the instruction or the rules given to the department head. Give an assignment of the rating from 1 to 10 on how well it meets the criterion.
so totally separate from their priority.
Well, apparently they do
I
both.
think it informs their prioritization.
Yeah, maybe that's right. Maybe it does.
Yeah, but like I said, I don't think we wanted to be in a situation where the priority score was the only factor in establishing priorities.
Yeah, okay, and I understand what you're saying, I think. Because the Department A may have a different rating, they may be better, they be more stricter or less stricter in assigning ratings because they can go from 1 to 10.
But in the same department, like this is DPW, you have a 1 with a 10 and a 3 with a 10 in the same department.
Yeah,
Right, but I think based
But
on
it-
what Len just read, that, and I started questioning that, that's now almost making sense to me. Because what I'm hearing is the rating was based on how well it meets those criteria. But the department head priority is the order in which that department head would like to see things get done.
Yes. And,
Mhm.
So that's where I'm saying it's two separate things. One may inform the other, one may not.
yeah, I mean,
Or-
I said, I
or-
think,
Everything is important and I'm just numbering my projects, 1 through whatever.
no, I trust that my department heads are giving this a serious look. And like I said,
Yeah.
one informs the other. But again, I think it's part quantitative, part qualitative.
All right, it's now 8:45.
Yeah.
You know, we could be on this for hours.
That was more.
Like I said, I'll send you the clean version of this as a PDF, which you can blow up on your computer and see all the columns. I think that, because I think the way this is, what you're sharing, Charles, is the frozen pane version of the capital. So it doesn't show you all of the other columns that are in there.
Yep. Look, I would also propose that, perhaps one of the things we look at in the upcoming year is this, because there's obviously the amount of time and thought and development that went into this. It's a great thing to have it be participatory and at a local level where people understand the real issues. And maybe, I think to Len's point, and it goes back to that consolidated document ultimately being the list that's used to try to adopt the capital plan going forward, is that this is, if this was what was in front of the board, it's understandable that there's so much information. It's hard to be able in an accelerated schedule process to be able to work with it and make decisions. But I think, personally, that you obviously wouldn't want to do away with this. It's to get from here to that final version, and also making sure everybody understands the mechanics of this and how it drives the consolidated spreadsheet with some confidence, that when somebody's looking at a very condensed thing that came out of this, that somebody can evaluate it, know how it was arrived at, be comfortable with it. I think it's all kind of commingled here, and this is the other piece. And then if I were having to make decisions about adopting what projects to do, I would want to understand, if I'm the board who have a lot on their plate, understanding this, understanding how the consolidated spreadsheet, the capital budget in plan was arrived at, and to some degree understanding the underlying cash flow mechanics that we can undertake the projects and execute them. I mean, those would be my pieces if I were sitting in that seat. So those are three different things that we could talk about looking at over the upcoming year. This, the cash flow, and the overtime, versus, fixed expense, higher analysis.
Len,
To
you
be
wanted to say
continued.
something before on that fixed expense.
Well,
Can
I
you say
think-
that again? No?
You
I-
wanted to say something earlier when we were talking about fixed expense.
Well, just quickly, because like you say, it's time to go to bed. But but my only point is, I don't buy the notion of fixed expense among staff. And I think the police department is a perfect example. Now, I have both good and bad experiences. Many, many years ago, I used to work in the mayor's budget office in New York City, and one of my departments I was responsible for was the NYPD. And the same thing happened every blanking year. Overtime would go up, we'd add more cops under the theory that it would reduce overtime. Never happened. And still now you read the daily news, overtime is through the roof in the police department, even though we have 50,000 officers. It's always going to happen. And what the key issue is, in my mind, is what Dan mentioned, is that we have probably a number of officers on disability. Yes, we have 54 or whatever the number it is on the roster. How many are actually working? How many are in the field doing police work? And so I think that's a very difficult issue. But my general feeling is, and I guess Dan said you mentioned the Bratton report, I don't recall that. But the key thing is, do we have the right complement? Are they deployed appropriately? This is a police chief judgment, of course. And are we having too many cops sitting behind a desk? Because we spent, when I was with the city many, many years ago, hundreds of millions of dollars to civilianize the police department. Why? Is because cops did not like being out on the street. And anytime they could sit behind a desk in the South Bronx would be much better than going out in an RMP. So there's all these complicating factors that affect the police department. But that aside, we've got the same question about the appropriate complements in each department. My own gut feeling is we may not be far off at all. In fact, certain departments, may need more people.
Right, I think a lot of it really gets to understanding what's driving all the overtime. So if we want to say, and I'm just making this up, with the DPW, what drives the overtime is snow clearing in the winter. That can't be controlled. They have to do that.
Yeah, in general, I think it's most of it is weather related, whether it be floods or snow.
But I think that's, for each department that has a significant amount of overtime, that's the key thing to get our arms around, I think.
Yeah.
What drives it?
And when we need to, if we know that we're coming up against our appropriation limit, we'll ask the board for additional funding, and the resolutions and backup material that accompany that request usually will say why, what the nature of the request is, what's driving it.
Yep.
So we can, we can certainly get that information should be pretty readily available.
Right, but that's when you need additional money.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about what's in the budget
Oh,
to begin with. What drives all the overtime? So, I don't know, just a thought.
Well,
yeah.
I found it to be,
Yeah, and department heads could answer that pretty readily. For when they prepare their annual budgets, they have to, they make the request. We say, how did you get to this number? So they typically have that answer
Okay.
because we hold them accountable.
do we want to make a motion to adjourn? I thought this was really very productive and thought-provoking. I'm looking forward to potentially working on a bunch of this stuff or helping with it where we can for the upcoming year. But did anyone want to talk about anything else, or do you want to make a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn.
I'll second.
All right, all those in favor?
All right.
Aye.
Aye.
And thanks a lot, Dan. You,
Yeah, Dan, thank you.
you held up well.
I'm actually wearing a flak jacket right now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
But you're
usually don't
wearing
go-
a building.
Well, that building has issues,
we
in case you haven't seen it. A lot of scaffolding around it.
We
We
appreciate it.
usually don't go this long, but thanks for being on the phone almost 2 hours. Next month is the 4th of July weekend, so Monday is the 4th. So our Tuesday would be the 5th. Is everybody okay with that, or is the village planning on?
So the
Hosting meetings.
governor just, the executive order allowing for the teleconference meetings expires as of the 14th. So, the board is going to be reviewing a local law which would allow us to, have some sort of ongoing process that would allow for teleconferencing in certain situations. But the part of the budget this year required certain, has changes about, when you have to announce where you are versus when you don't if you participate remotely. But I think there will be more information on that to follow. But right now, the schedule is, it's in person as of the 14th.
Okay, in person as the 14th, but with the 4th of July holiday,
Oh, okay.
is everybody,
Oh,
is
okay.
the village on the 5th?
I'll not be in Mamaroneck on the 5th.
Yeah, me neither, so. Same.
All
here.
right, so that people are going to be on holiday. Do you guys want to look at alternate dates for
Or-
next month's meeting?
Or should we skip next month's meeting?
I mean, if you want, I mean, you can always do like a doodle poll to see if there's a common date that works, and you might want to talk to Sally too about what the schedule is for July. I mean, I know like the board has, one full meeting and then a limited agenda meeting during the summer. But obviously it's your board, your decision.
You guys have a preference to defer to August, the beginning of August? Or to try to reschedule sometime in July?
I'm fine if we
could
wait
also
till
do-
August.
I'm okay with,
Glenn and Ed,
yeah, I'm okay with that.
Glenn, are you all right with that?
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, the only thing is, we're going away to Maine the whole month of July. We may be back the first week in August, but I think we should definitely schedule a meeting for August, whether or not I'm able to attend.
Okay, so, all right, so we'll plan on adjourning until August. And if the first Tuesday doesn't work for you, Len, maybe we could push that another week out. And then we can touch base with Tom to see what his availability is as well.
Okay.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
All right, well, have a great first part of the summer, everyone, and we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Well, thanks.
Okay, good night,
All
guys.
right. Thank you.
Thanks again, Dan.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.